Law 42, strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter. Trouble can often be traced to a single strong individual, the stirrer, the arrogant underling, the poisoner of goodwill. If you allow such people room to operate, others will succumb to their influence. Do not wait for the troubles they cause to multiply. Do not try to negotiate with them. They are irredeemable. Neutralize their influence by isolating or banishing them. Strike at the source of the trouble, and the sheep will scatter. This is Ron. Welcome to Storytime. This is Tuesday, August the 30th, and I've been reading from the 48 Laws of Power, and today, Law 42. In the past, an entire nation would be ruled by a king and his handful of ministers. Only the elite had any power to play with. Over the centuries, power has gradually become more and more diffused and democratized. This has created, however, a common misperception that groups no longer have centers of power. The power is spread out and scattered among people. Actually, however, power has changed in its numbers, but not in its essence. There may be fewer mighty tyrants commanding the power of life and death over millions, but there remain thousands of petty tyrants ruling smaller realms and enforcing their will through indirect power games, charisma, and so on. In every group, power is concentrated in the hands of one or two people. For this is one area in which human nature will never change. People will congregate around a single strong personality, like planets orbiting a sun. To labor under the illusion that this kind of power center no longer exists is to make endless mistakes, waste energy and time, and never hit the target. Powerful people never waste time. Outwardly, they may play along with the game, pretending that power is shared among many, but inwardly they keep their eyes on the inevitable few in the group who hold the cards. These are the ones they work on. When troubles arise, they look for the underlying cause, the single strong character who started the stirring and whose isolation or banishment will settle the waters again. In his family therapy practice, Dr. Milton H. Erickson found that if the family dynamic was unsettled and dysfunctional, there was inevitably one person who was the stirrer, the troublemaker. In his sessions, he would symbolically isolate this rotten apple by seating him or her apart from the others, if only by a few feet. Slowly, the other members of the family would see the physically separate person as the source of their difficulty. Once you recognize who the stirrer is, pointing it out to other people will accomplish a great deal. Understanding who controls the group dynamic is a critical realization. Remember, stirrers thrive by hiding in the group, disguising their actions among the reactions of others. Render their actions visible, and they lose their power to upset. A key element in games of strategy is isolating the enemy's power. In chess, you try to corner the king. In the Chinese game of Go, you try to isolate the enemy's forces in small pockets, rendering them immobile and ineffectual. It is often better to isolate your enemies than to destroy them. You seem less brutal. The result, though, is the same, for in the game of power, isolation spells death. The most effective form of isolation is somehow to separate your victims from their power base. When Mao Zedong wanted to eliminate an enemy in the ruling elite, he did not confront the person directly. He silently and stealthily worked to isolate the man, divide his allies, and turn them away from him, shrink his support. Soon the man would vanish on his own. Presence and appearance have great import in the game of power. To seduce, particularly in the beginning stages, you need to be constantly present, or create the feeling that you are. If you are often out of sight, the charm will wear off. Queen Elizabeth's Prime Minister, Robert Cecil, had two main rivals, the Queen's favorite, the Earl of Essex, and her former favorite, Sir Walter Raleigh. He contrived to send them both on a mission to Spain. With them away from the court, he managed to wrap his tentacles around the Queen, secure his position as her top advisor, and weaken her affection for Raleigh and the Earl. The lesson here is twofold. First, your absence from the court spells danger for you, and you should never leave the scene in a time of turmoil, for your absence can both symbolize and induce a loss of power. Second, and on the other hand, luring your enemies away from the court at critical moments is a great ploy. Isolation has other strategic uses. When trying to seduce people, it is often wise to isolate them from their usual social context. Once isolated, they are vulnerable to you, and your presence becomes magnified. Similarly, con artists look often for ways to isolate their marks from their normal social milieu, steering them into new environments in which they are no longer comfortable. Here they feel weak and succumb to deception more easily. Isolation, then, can prove a powerful way of bringing people under your spell to seduce or swindle them. You will often find powerful people who have alienated themselves from the group. Perhaps their power has gone to their heads, and they consider themselves superior. Perhaps they've lost the knack of communicating with ordinary folk. Remember, this makes them vulnerable. Powerful though they may be, people like this can be turned to use. The monk Rasputin gained his power over Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia through their tremendous isolation from the people. Alexandra in particular was a foreigner and especially alienated from everyday Russians. Rasputin used his peasant origins to insinuate himself into her good graces, for she desperately wanted to communicate with her subjects. Once in the court's inner circle, Rasputin made himself indispensable and attained great power. Heading straight for the center, he aimed for the one figure in Russia who commanded power. The Tsarina dominated her husband. And he found that he had no need to isolate her for the work was already done. The Rasputin strategy can bring you great power. Always search out people who hold high positions, yet find themselves isolated on the board. They are like apples falling into your lap, easily seduced and able to catapult you into power yourself. Finally, the reason you strike at the shepherd is because such an action will dishearten the sheep beyond any rational measure. When Hernando Cortez and Francisco Pizarro led their tiny forces against the Aztec and Incan empires, they did not make the mistake of fighting on several fronts, nor were they intimidated by the numbers arrayed against them. They captured the kings, Moctezuma and Atahualpa. Vast empires fell into their hands. With the leader gone, the center of gravity is gone. There's nothing to revolve around, and everything falls apart. Aim at the leaders, bring them down, and look for the endless opportunities in the confusion that will ensue. Reversal. Any harm you do to a man should be done in such a way that you need not fear his revenge, writes Machiavelli. If you act to isolate your enemy, make sure he lacks the means to repay the favor. If you apply this law, in other words, apply it from a position of superiority, so that you have nothing to fear from his resentment. Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor as U.S. President, saw Ulysses S. Grant as a troublesome member of his government, so he isolated Grant as a prelude to forcing him out. This only enraged the great general, however, who responded by forming a support base in the Republican Party and going on to become the next president. It would have been far wiser to keep a man like Grant in the fold, where he could do less harm, than to make him revengeful. And so you may often find it better to keep people on your side, where you can watch them, than to risk creating an angry enemy. Keeping them close, you can secretly whittle away at their support base so that when the time comes to cut them loose, they will fall fast and hard without knowing what hit them. And that was Law 42 of the 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. And on Thursday, the 1st of September, we're going to be reading Law 43, Work on the Hearts and Minds of Others. Coercion creates a reaction that will eventually work against you. You must seduce others into wanting to move in your direction. A person you have seduced becomes your loyal pawn, and the way to seduce others is to operate on their individual psychologies and weaknesses. Soften up the resistant by working on their emotions, playing on what they hold dear and what they fear. Ignore the hearts and minds of others, and they will grow to hate you. And that's going to be on Thursday, September the 1st. Thank you for joining me, and have a great day.